stab at this. As I say, this is one we did last Monday on the 20th, and we're doing it again today on the 27th. We took down the YouTube version of this from last Monday because we wanted to make some edits to it and add some information to it. Hopefully to make it a little clearer and easier to grasp. I don't know about you, Steph, but I'm getting emails with agents in the thick of these trying to use the Addendum AC and having questions that are unique. Each one is unbelievable. And that's what we see in real estate. The transactions are individual, they're unique, and to try to fit a universal clause into some of these makes it a little confusing.
Yeah.
So we'll go through it again today, hopefully with some edits and some ideas. And I'm referring mostly to the inspection clause on the Addendum AC, but also we're having some confusions with the escalation clause and even some having questions about the appraisal clause. So the Addendum AC was brought to our attention because these individual contingencies are more prevalent now in a competitive market that we're still in. We're still getting multiple offers. Buyers are still trying to find any incentive possible to win the seller's favor. And that's where these clauses come in. The contingency clause with the threshold language, the appraisal gap language, and the escalation clause. They're all designed to be incentives to the sellers, but still give the buyer some protection of contingencies. So instead of sending in an offer that has no inspection, no appraisal, no financing, then the buyer is at incredible risk. And you as a buyer's agent should be reluctant to put your buyer at this risk. This way we can sort of meet in the middle using some of these clauses. But it also, this new one does give us some consistency across the marketplace, because before we had about 5 or 6, as far as I knew, escalation clauses. And they were very confusing trying to sort them all out. And this Addendum AC is optional. You don't have to use it, but as I say, it's a way to get in a contingency for your buyer and still give a little incentive to the seller. So as we go through these transactions one at a time and see how they affect, we do need patience. There will be differences in opinions or interpretations with these clauses. And that's where Steph and I are getting calls to try to clear out these differences of opinions and interpretations. It is very, very important to consult with the lenders when you're using these clauses. When you're modifying the appraisal gap, you better check with your lender to see if the buyer has the ability to pay half of the appraisal gap or whatever. That they do have the money to buy down some of the costs of the inspection, or to escalate their price into the upper atmospheres. The lender may have some concern with those. And as I said previously, these are case by case. Not everyone is going to fit every square transaction into a round hole, or the other way around. Okay. This is where you find the new Addendum AC. Steph pointed this out in her slides. It's titled, starting with Greater Milwaukee Association, or GMAR, Addendum AC. So if you're looking in the search and alphabetically, start with Greater Milwaukee Association of Realtors title. There'll be this one, which is a Addendum A, and this one, which is the Addendum AC. So that's where you find them for you. So here's the addendum AC. It starts out with the, get me over there, putting the offer to purchase. So you tie it to the offer to purchase dated at the date of the offer to purchase made by the buyers with respect to the property at, you give the address in the state of Wisconsin. This is only to be used for the state of Wisconsin. Wow. And wait, I've got to jump back.
There you go.
Bumping me. Okay. So we're going to go to the first one, the inspection threshold language. And as I said, this actually puts it to, let me just see if I can tighten this up. It puts it to, I still will have an inspection contingency. The buyer still has that way of seeing what the property is like before they are able to close on it. So the buyer, what this gap shows is the buyer will agree not to submit any notice of defects or amendment for repairs. Now, this is something I don't think a lot of agents have hooked onto yet. Not to submit any notice or amendment for repairs, replacement, credit, or price reduction under the inspection contingency in the offer, unless, so this addendum AC is attached to the offer. The offer has the inspection contingency checked, but now this addendum AC is going to modify that inspection contingency by saying, unless the cumulative estimated cost to repair or replace the defects identified in the inspection exceed, and this is where you put your buyer's threshold. Your buyer is going to be willing to put in this amount of money to either repair or cure a defect. If the buyer delivers a notice of defect, seller's election to cure only applies to the balance of items for which the cumulative cost to repair or replace exceeds the amount stated on line 10. So note this, it means if the seller now has delivered, excuse me, if the buyer has delivered a notice of defect and the seller has the right to cure, the seller's election to cure applies only to the balance of the items for which the cumulative cost to repair or replace exceeds the amount on line 10. This is separate from negotiating with an amendment. If the repairs are exceeding this number in line 10, before you serve a notice of defect, the buyer can now send to the seller an amendment saying, please, fix this, do that, but only if the defects are over the line 10. But if they send a notice of defect and the seller elects to cure, he only has to cure to the balance of the item for which the cumulative cost to repair or replace. Now that's where the mumble jumble applies, and this is where we put in some examples to help you understand. So if the buyer states exceeds $5,000 and the cumulative cost of the defects is $10,000, the seller has the right to cure these defects, but only $5,000 worth of it. So this buyer has to be able to come up with the first $5,000 because it's over the limit. Estimated costs for repair or replacement shall be obtained from independent qualified contractors, professionals selected by the buyer. Seller agrees to provide access for the buyer and the buyer's qualified professional or contractors to obtain such estimates. This is important. The buyer shall pay any costs associated with obtaining these estimates. So sometimes contractors will charge an up fee, just go out and give an estimate. The buyer has to pay those in order to get these estimates of costs. The buyers may together agree on the cost. Sorry. Keep hitting the wrong button. Now the buyers agree to on the cost to repair or replace the deck for purpose of this provision. The estimate obtained or agreed upon are utilized only for the execution of this provision and do not affect any seller right to cure unless specifically agreed in writing. One or more of the following provisions may be included if checked. Seller may, if you check this one, seller may also obtain estimates. So they don't like the buyer's professional or contractor's estimates, they can also get their own and deliver to buyer by the deadline for the inspection contingency. If delivered before any notice of defects is delivered to to seller by buyer. I'm making this more confusing. Based on the estimates obtained by the buyer. If the seller timely delivers such estimate and the estimates differ from the buyer's estimates for the same items or costs, the parties agree they will average the different estimates for the affected item to arrive at the cost for purposes of this provision, to arrive at the cost of the threshold on line 10. Either party may extend the original deadline or the either party may extend the original deadline for the inspection contingency by 5 days if left blank to allow for follow-up inspections or to obtain estimates. And either party may do this by delivering a written notice of extension. Now, usually we have extensions of the inspection contingency have to be done by an amendment and agreed to by both parties. However, if this box is checked, it means that one party can send a notice to automatically extend the inspection contingency by 5 days in order to get probably more results from contractors or qualified professionals on their estimates. Any questions here? Now, the next couple slides, we're going to go into some examples and stories that hopefully clear up a lot of this language.
If it's clear as mud right now, that's totally understandable.
Any questions? All right, let me go to the next thing. Line 9 uses the cumulative and adds an S to defects. So it doesn't have to be one particular defect. It can be the costs of several defects that will rise up to that threshold amount on line 10. Therefore, it can be used from one or more. If one item is above the item on line 10, the notice could be given, or if all the items add up to the number on line 10, the notice or amendment could be sent. Buyer is agreeing not to send a notice or an amendment if the total costs fall under the threshold. I think that's a key sentence in understanding this. We're not going to be dealing with anything that falls under that amount on line 10. That means the buyer is going to take responsibility for any defects that are found in the inspection report on his own. He is not going to ask the seller to repair or give the notice of defect to the seller if that total cost falls under the threshold. If the seller elects to cure, seller will only be responsible for the cost to cure the defect or defects over the threshold on line 10. So go back to this threshold of $5,000. The total amount of defects found in this by estimates brought in by professionals, say, is $7,000. The seller now will only be responsible for $2,000 the buyer will eat up the original 5,000 as he's agreed to. Is that clear?
Now, we have yet to see how these kind of scenarios are going to play out.
Right.
I'm sorry. Hi, this is Noah. That's a little different than I think what we talked about the last time.
It is.
So,
And that's why we scrapped.
Exactly the opposite, actually. So,
Yeah. Well, yes, that's why we scrapped last week's, because we realized, and I realized from a email that Corey Lamont sent us, that we were emphasizing the wrong thing. And Steph and I went back and forth between ourselves and talking about this. And then we got, Steph reached out to Corey Lamont again and said, please, describe this a little more clearly. And she did. And this is what we came back with. We were muddying the water even more last Monday.
Yeah.
With this correction from Corey Lamont and Steph and I continuing to talk this out, this is what the threshold for inspection means. The seller will only be responsible for the cost to cure the defects over the threshold line.
okay.
So
And
we yanked last Mondays and revised this slide and the next slide.
okay. And thank you for that clarification. And just to not to get ahead of everything, but does that also, is that also true for now the appraisal gap language that we were talking about? Which in what I understood from last week's meeting was going to be that once you cross that threshold, everything's back on the table again.
That is not explicit. It does not explicitly state that a seller is only on the hook for the balance of an appraisal gap. So how we had taught it last week still remains true.
Exactly. The editing is only on this inspection threshold provision.
So if the appraisal is lower than the gap, the buyer can make a request and renegotiate all of it again, just like
Correct.
we learned. Okay,
Right.
thank
Right.
you.
Yeah, in the inspection threshold, they're just saying the buyer can't even start to negotiate with the seller on repairs needed if the estimate to repair them or replace them exceeds the threshold amount. In the appraisal gap, they can always negotiate back and forth.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So this was actually from an email that Corey Lamont sent to Steph and to me. And I think this helped us clear it up because it's, instead of reading the language, it is a conversational way to discuss this. The language is intended to say that if the buyer includes $5,000 on line 10 and then provides a notice of defects for $10,000, the seller is only on the hook to cure $5,000 of that cure. The buyer basically has said, I am good to cover $5,000. Anything above that, seller, I am saying I need you to cover. And Corey goes on, in some markets, it is referred to as an inspection gap. That way the seller knows the buyer isn't coming to them until the repairs hit a certain amount. Obviously, the sellers like this in a seller's market. The buyer should be very honest with themselves about that breaking point financially. And this is where I said initially that the buyer should be talking to their lender to make sure that they can come up with this $5,000 or gap in the threshold amount and what the actual defects are. So again, you can't work with your buyer and put these figures in until you really confirm with the lender that those figures are going to be available to the buyer. Any questions on this slide? And this is the one that I added based on Corey's response. I think in her talking about it conversationally in a situation, it does clear it up a little better. There's still, I got 3 emails over the weekend of instances in individual transactions, which made it hard to think through. And again, you know, when things are hard to think through and they involve a contract and nobody can really figure it out and nobody's really agreeing on things, that's the time to go to a legal counsel. And that may be the way to include some interpretations of these individual situations. Anything else on the inspection contingency threshold, part of this addendum AC? Good to go. All right. The next section of the appraisal AC, of the addendum AC is the appraisal gap. And this just says that the buyer represents the buyer's consulted with the buyer's lender before including this provision. They even put this in the addendum AC because it is so critical to the buyer's funds. So the buyer is saying, if the offer includes an appraisal contingency and the appraisal value is less than the purchase price, the buyer agrees to cover the difference up to, and you put in the appraisal gap. So that means the buyer has the funds to cover a difference if there is an appraisal gap between the purchase price and the appraised value. Buyer hereby represents that buyer has sufficient funds to cover the gap and amount financed in the financing commitment contingency in the offer. Actually, that sentence should be up there in the inspection contingency too. Buyer is hereby prohibited from sending a notice objecting to the appraised value unless the appraised value is lower than the purchase price minus the appraisal gap. So taking into consideration the gap that the buyer is willing to cover, if the appraisal is even lower than that gap, then the buyer can send a notice objecting to the appraised value. But if it's just under the under the purchase price and within that appraisal gap, the buyer cannot send a notice objecting to the appraised value. If the seller has the right to cure the appraisal contingency in the offer, seller may satisfy the contingency by delivering a written notice to buyer adjusting the purchase price up to the value shown on the appraisal report, plus the appraisal gap. And all other terms of the appraisal contingency remain the same. So this is how this provision works with the seller if the seller has the right to cure in the buyer's offer. So he can satisfy the contingency up to the appraisal report plus the appraisal gap. But as we talked about earlier, they can still negotiate back and forth on this after they take into consideration the appraisal gap. Any questions on the appraisal gap language? Now remember, this hooks onto and goes along with the offer to purchase that has the appraisal contingency in it, and even if it has the seller has right to cure in the appraisal contingency. So this is how that appraisal gap works when the appraisal and the right to cure the appraisal are in the original offer. Any questions on that? Check the chat. Yeah, and Steph says, yes, this can be used with FHA.
Yeah, the process of the FHA appraisal will not change based off of the AC. So that's going to play out the same way.
The FHA appraisal is going to be not only a price difference, but it can also be a work order difference.
Mm-hmm.
And that would still be in play that doesn't affect the gap. Okay, now we go to the next fun provision in the addendum AC, and this is the escalation clause. In our competitive market, and there's still a lot of areas around the Milwaukee area that are still getting multiple offers. It's a seller's market, and the buyers are doing everything they can to make their offer shine above the other offers. And so they're giving incentives to the seller, saying, I want an inspection, but I'll cover some of this cost. I want an appraisal, but I'll cover some of the gap between the appraised value and purchase price if there is one. I'll cover the purchase price by escalating my price over any competing offers by checking the escalation clause language. So again, we've had many different varieties of the escalation clause throughout all the different firms in the Milwaukee area. This one, hopefully, by coming out as a GMAR addendum, that most of the firms will adopt this one addendum AC, and so we have one escalation clause in effect. So this reads, if the seller accepts this offer and receives one or more additional bona fide offers, they can't do it if they just have one offer, they need a competing offer or offers with terms acceptable to the seller, other offers, no later than, and the date is important, which result in a net proceeds of sale. That means the purchase price minus any monetary contributions by the seller. So it's not cash closing costs or anything. Payable to the seller equal to or greater than the net proceeds of the seller, payable to the seller under this offer, then the purchase price of this offer shall automatically increase to an amount which generates net proceeds of sale to the seller, and then you put in that amount. So this is what the automatic increase is going to be if there is a competing offer, say $1,000. So you put in that price, $1,000, in excess of the highest net proceeds of sale generated in such other offers. Now, the next couple of lines can be a little confusing. It says that this purchase price may be increased once or more than once. So it means once, this is my one-shot deal, competing offer, I'm going to go $1,000 over any the other competing offers. Now, more than once, if that is checked, it may be that more offers come in and another higher price competing offer is, and then the this buyer who is writing this offer will be able to increase another $1,000 over another offer that has a higher amount. So if the purchase price of this offer is increased based on one or more other offers, seller shall no later than blank days, and 2 is default, after receipt of said other offers, submit to buyer a signed amendment to the offer to purchase reflecting the adjusted purchase price and copy of any other offers that resulted in and were the basis for the increase of the purchase price of this offer. The purchase price remains the same if the seller does not provide the amendment. So this means that the seller has to communicate to the buyer at the buyer's email address, which is provided in this provision, a copy of a signed amendment by the seller to the buyer saying this is the agreed upon price. So they have an accepted offer, this seller confirming it directly to the buyer in an amendment, and a copy of the other offer that it resulted in that jump to the buyer at buyer's email address. Of course, the seller would cross out the name of the other buyer and any other aspects. I really believe that they can just send the first page that shows the price. So this amendment then confirms the agreed upon escalated price that the buyer is willing to pay. If they don't send that, if the seller doesn't provide that amendment, the original purchase price remains the same. And I've seen that happen. So on line 44, this is the max at the price that the buyer will go if being escalated up and above and up and above, either once or more than once. A lot of confusion, a lot of calls I've had where the seller and the seller's agent think that the buyer's maximum price is what they're going up to. And I don't know how many times we have to say it, but it is the incremental amount over the other offer's price that is the affirmed accepted price. It doesn't jump all the way up to the maximum price that the buyer is willing to offer. And an amendment sent from the seller to the buyer is what confirms that this is the new price in this accepted offer. Buyer agrees to accept the amendment and deliver it back to the seller according to the delivery items in this offer and by the deadline for acceptance in the amendment. Code REEB 2412 prohibits a licensed real estate agent from disclosing any of the terms of one prospective buyer's offer to purchase, exchange agreement, or option contract proposal to any other prospective buyer, to any person with the intent of information to be disclosed by any other prospective buyer. Accordingly, delivery of other offers must be conducted solely between, trying to get rid of this thing, solely between the buyer and the seller. What they're saying is it's illegal for an agent to deliver that amendment and the other offer confirming the escalated price because the agent is not supposed to exchange other buyers' terms of another offer. So that is why it is mandatory that an addendum, excuse me, the amendment to confirm the price plus the copy of the other offers that resulted in the escalation are sent from the seller to the buyer at the buyer's email address. Any questions on the escalation clause language? Do you have it? What happens when a seller receives multiple escalation clauses in multiple offers? What does the seller at that point do? Can these multiple offers use to increase the price up to the maximum amount? It depends on what the incremental amount is on line 40. And then what the buyer's maximum price is on line 44. Now, at this point, the seller can do anything they want. Say they get multiple escalation clauses in multiple offers. They can sort it out. It's best to do a spreadsheet, make sure that the seller is aware of not just this price changing, but aware of the other terms in the offer. And sometimes those can be as important or more important than the escalated price. So develop a spreadsheet for your seller, line out what all the other offers are, and then do the math with the escalation clauses. Or use a multiple counteroffer. If choosing to exercise an escalation clause, the offer is simply accepted And evidence of the other offer is delivered to the buyer after an accepted offer. So evidence of the other offer plus the amendment are delivered to the buyer after the accepted offer. It is now clear that the seller's side initiates the amendment to change the price. Stated right in the provision that the buyer must deliver the amendment back by the deadline.
We're just highlighting these two because these were omissions in previous language we were using, and we were just really excited about the fact that it's clear now, so.
Right. So it is important that you as a buyer's agent really make sure that your buyer understands what they're doing here. You as a listing agent have conversations with your sellers so that they understand what these escalation clauses mean. A lot of times that maximum price that is put into an escalation clause really widens the seller's eyes. Oh my God, they see they'll go up to 250. No. That doesn't mean that they're offering 250. They have to be bumped up to 250 by the escalation amounts, by the incremental amounts. But it does make the seller a little hungry for, boy, if they'll go up to that, why not go up to that? And that is where we get some concerns with using the escalation clause. There is now a standard form, our Addendum AC, but there's a lot of areas where it is not clear. The complication of juggling multiple offers with escalation clauses, doing the math. You're getting into escalated prices here. Maybe that's going to affect the inflated value or the appraised value. They may escalate all the way up the ladder and yet find out that the appraisal won't come anywhere near that. And those are things that the listing agent has to explain to the seller, and the buyer's agent has to explain to the buyer. So as you can imagine, some attorneys are a little leery of the escalation clause, especially with multiple offers with escalation clauses. A seller can counter at any price, though, even over the list price. If here's that example. I'm sorry. So here's one where the offer came in at 235, escalating 1,000 over the highest offer up to 243, and they can only adjust once. Offer 2 comes in at 240 with no escalation. Offer 3 comes in at 239, escalating 500 over the highest offer, up to a max of 242. And they can adjust more than once. So the highest offer of the 3 is 240. To maximize sale price, add 500 from offer 3, that makes it 240, 500. Add 1,000 from offer 1, that's 241.5. If we can escalate again, then offer 3 can add another 500 to that at 242. So this is where the math comes in. This is where using the escalation clause more than once comes in, where it can be more confusing. Sometimes I think it's better to limit the escalation clauses to once. If you're writing an escalation clause, maybe at once. But here you see that offer 3 that had the chance to do multiple escalations added up to most money for this seller. But really, it's only $500 more. So going through a lot of angst and math and confusion for another $500 in this example, this is where it gets really messy.
Joan, can you share the last screen just one more time?
You mean go back?
Yep.
This one.
I think we wanted to see what the, yeah, that one.
Okay.
Or,
No, this is before.
yeah, sorry, that's, yep, there we go, that one. There you go, and I don't know who NJ is, but there you go.
So this is, they're saying, you know, which of these offers would net the most to the seller? And these are the three offers. This is what they look at. But as you saw the results of the math being done, you saw that actually offer number 3 won because it could adjust more than once. And it got it up to
242.5, right?
but see, it couldn't go to 242.5 because it had a max of 242.5. So the most it could go was 242. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, that's correct. So it went up from 241.5 to 242. And that was, it turned out to be its max. It couldn't go any higher. So it did show that having that second escalation did net the seller another $500. So it was the one that was most. But as we also saw, it really isn't that much of a difference between the other offers, well, $2,000. Any other questions on this situation? Now, in lieu of this, in lieu of looking at maybe multiple escalation clauses in multiple offers, the best response might be multiple counteroffer. A seller can counter at any price, even over the list price. So he may consider looking at, say, these three offers. He would counter out the escalation clause, which would be mandatory. He'd have to put that in as multiple counter to all three offers. And then he'd counter each offer to its highest price. And then he can also address other terms of the offer in those individual counter offers to the multiple buyers. And sometimes, though, one of those multiple buyers could come back with another counter to his multiple counter, he might be able to even get more. So the best response when you're getting multiple counter offers may be countering out the escalation clause, number one, and then countering each offer up to its highest price.
I feel like I have been giving that advice more often than not when we're receiving multiple offers with escalation clauses. You know, another thing that you can do is, you know, pick one offer and choose to negotiate and see where it goes. And, you know, if it doesn't go anywhere, then you've got other offers to choose from. But we really would just love to have questions on case-by-case basis like this. You know, if you have confusion, if you just want to talk it out, you know, 9 times out of 10, our questions are just from agents, who just want to talk out these scenarios, right? And bounce ideas off of us. So please just know that that is, you know, 100% what we're here for as well, besides just these black and white, you know, contractual questions.
Yeah. Over the weekend, I got a call from an agent who had received multiple offers, multiple counter offers. And we literally, the two of us, went through the scenario of what to do on each offer and what the math would be, taking into consideration their incremental cost and up to their max, and what that would net the seller. And then we went through what it would be for a multiple counter and countering each offer based on their situation. And we determined that actually the taking one offer, rejecting the other two, countering out the escalation clause, and just countering one offer up to its maximum price, which was considerably more, not considerably, but more than the other two offers, even with the escalation clause. But we really had to talk this through. It was something that wasn't evident when we first started talking about it, but as we talked it through, we saw that this was probably the best approach to the seller to net more proceeds. And Steph and I are always willing to talk these through with you. As I'm saying, this will all go away when the market shifts and it becomes a buyer's market. And then the sellers will be looking for incentives to buyers. But as long as we are still having multiple offers, we can utilize a more consistent addendum by this new addendum AC, and choosing to use one or two or three of the options provisions if you want to amend your offer at all. But the benefit, it does give the buyer the opportunity to include important contingencies in their offer, but giving a little incentive to the seller as basically.
Just a great way to protect both buyers and incentivize sellers. So,
yeah. So I hope I didn't make it muddier.
No, that was great.
But it is something to read the actual addendum AC and then to explore the interpretations. Number one importance, though, is to, as an agent for the buyer or an agent for the seller, that you need to educate your client on what these provisions mean and what they mean to them. And then when they get offers, what is the objective that that client wants. So again,